Dit is Maandag die 18de Maart. Selina graciously moved amongst the guests with trays brimming with champagne-filled glasses. When everyone had been served, Ashley held up his hand. To the success of our fortunes. To our fortune, they echoed. And, last but not least, to our lovely ladies here tonight. Our ladies. How cute, one young lady exclaimed as she winked an eye at the man at her side. Slightly shifting that one white, shapely leg showed through the slit in her long dress. Klaus stood a little apart from the others. He didn't share in the festivities. His somber, clouded face reflected his depressed mood as he drank one glass after the other. The cunning female play for his attention went unnoticed as he thought of Cathy. The fallout with her was far more serious than he was willing to admit. After the second phone call this morning, it was evident that this wasn't just another passing argument. Cathy was feeling strongly about this whole silly business, and he had to admit that he had never expected such a reaction from her. Why, he thought wryly. He could have any woman in the room if he wanted to. He could have any woman in the room if he wanted to. There were dozens just waiting for the chance to be seen with him. And here he was, sulking over one rebellious woman. But why not? Why not Cathy? He had demanded, experiencing a flare of suspicion. Is there someone else? The very idea had appalled him. She had paused briefly. Yes, Klaus, I think there is. Cathy, you can't be serious. He was shocked. Who on earth? And with a rush of jealousy, he remembered the tall, powerfully built man on the day of his visit with Dan Johnson. It's the boer, he had guessed. Klaus, please just forget about me. I am serious. Never, he had roared furiously. I will see you in... And he never finished his sentence, for the line had gone dead. For the second time in his life, a woman had hung up in his ears, and maybe that was one of the reasons why he felt so humiliated and upset. The apparent concept of her actions, hell, at least he had expected some remorse and regret, but there was none. His ruined self-image was all Rob de Boer's fault. Klaus gnashed his teeth with seething anger, muttering murderous threats as he emptied the last of a bottle into his glass. He gulped the contents down and turned for another bottle when he became aware of another person close to him. You seem awfully preoccupied. Disturbed, Klaus glared at the slender girl, noticing her friendly smile. Slowly the scroll disappeared as he relaxed. Oh, Lucy, it's just a few problems at work, he answered casually and tried to look as unconcerned as possible. It's Cathy that's bothering you, isn't it? She persisted and he nodded reluctantly. Oh, Klaus, there are many others. She smiled sympathetically to soothe his hurt ego, and he felt his mood lifting. Let's not talk about my problems. To hell with Cathy, he thought, as he took Lucy's arm, feeling light-headed and quite drunk. We'll have some fun of our own. He looked at her in question. You are alone too? She nodded wistfully. All alone. Klaus thought of Cathy with regret, and then saw the promising look in Lucy's expectant eyes. You are no longer alone, he announced smugly and led her to the snack table. He would show Cathy, and he drained another glass, grinning at his new partner. The fine drizzle showered the small harbour and powerboat club as Rob and Cathy walked hand in hand along the deserted wooden jetty. Kathy, wearing the same woolen cap and scarf as the previous evening, had fished out a similar cap for Rob, which she had promptly put on his head when he fetched her. They were as light-hearted and carefree as two people who had just found themselves in love, but still hesitant to express it. And they laughed at the silliness of a lonely seagull braving the weather on a cold, decaying wooden bollard. Rob tossed the piece of chocolate at it, and the bird burst into life, dashing to the chocolate, scooping it up, squeaking and swallowing it. Completing its wide, sweeping flight, the bird once again settled on the bollard, shook its feathers once, and seemed to doze off instantly. Phew! Kathy laughed with delight, snuggling against him. That was quick, huh? Poor thing must be famished. Here, give me the rest of the chocolate bar. What are you doing? He protested as she snatched the chocolate from his hand and stripped off the paper. Here, take care of this. And with a giggle, she pushed the paper back into his hands. There, you poor thing, she invited the seagull. The chocolate disappeared down the bird's throat. Kathy was awed. I swear he can swallow a whole hamburger in one gulp. It's a she, Rob remarked solemnly. Really? And how do you know that? Simple. Her big mouth. Ah, big mouth. I won't say another word. And she shut her mouth with such ferocity that he burst out laughing. Playfully pulling her against his shoulder, they stared back towards the parked car. I tell you what, he grinned. Let's go somewhere for lunch. I'm sure you know just the right place. In Neisner at the Heads. It's a wonderful place. She stopped aghast, one hand flying to her lips. I've talked. She sounded so disappointed that Rob began to laugh all over again. After a moment, she joined in and said shyly, You don't really want me to be quiet, do you? Not really, and he kissed her. They had been wandering around the town since early morning, searching for those items they needed for the continuation of the wreck diving. They could easily got it all at Klaus's boat shop and hire service, but Kathy was firm about that. She wanted nothing from him, and Rob was secretly glad. He didn't want a run-in with her ex at this stage, and definitely not today. A 2-cylinder diesel engine with accompanying pump and hoses were found at a friend of Kathy's, and a 35-foot fishing boat with its owner and skipper had been hired on the spot. The skipper, an old man with grey hair and friendly wrinkled face, was only too willing. Rob instantly liked old Jos Verwysing and offered a handsome price for his boat and services. So, with the boat and pump sorted, they were free to spend the rest of the rainy Saturday. Meanwhile, back in the park, Herbie had a miserable day. His effort to fish from his usual spot had nearly ended in disaster when a large wave almost washed him into the sea. Determined to outlive the day, he had exchanged the fishing rod for a book, but the novel failed to hold his attention. After many cold buster brandies, he began to regret leaving his car in Cape Town. But at last, bored out of his skull, he settled beside a low burning fire. On his lap was the logbook of the Liberty. He had never read it properly. In the steakhouse of Neisner, Rob and Kathy were busy with the second bottle of Vin d'Eau. It was still raining outside, although the wind had dropped. The white horses on the sea were slowly receding. Chapter 7. Old Jos Verwysing stood firmly in the stern of his boat, with one hand firmly on the tiller, the other clenching his pipe, his wizened old eyes roamed over the ocean. In the quiet moments of dawn, he steered the 35-footer eastward across Plettenberg Bay. The weary and outdated old 4-cylinder diesel inboard motor ran reassuringly strong, while the bow pushed a steady 9 knots through the waves, leaving behind a long straight wake. He glanced over the boat. There was nothing extraordinary about it. It was a sturdy vessel with a mast and derrick, a small saloon in the bow, and an open flat deck with 3-foot-high gunwale all around. Standing on the open deck, looking weirdly out of place, stood the diesel engine and the pump with the hoses. Josh grimaced wryly at the thought of that. For the first time in 25 years that he had owned the boat, it was going to sea without its nets and fishing equipment. An albatross slowly flew past, squawking, and Jos shivered with a sudden feeling of bad premonition. Apprehensively, he glanced at the sea and sky, but saw nothing which should worry him. The sea, although strong, was acceptable. There was almost no wind. The barometer had gone up and the weather forecast predicted fine and sunny weather for the days ahead. But the uneasy feeling kept haunting him, and he absently wondered whether the uncomfortable feeling wasn't just guilt for taking his curiously named boat on a treasure hunt. The Flying Dutchman. Jos could never really understand why its former owner had chosen the name, for it was in no way resembling anything flying or ghost-like. It was by exception a fishing boat, and gold was for the greedy and the evil. He crossed his fingers, momentarily regretting his decision. That albatross. Good luck for fishing, but this time it wasn't fishing. But he wasn't always doing it for the gold. They had hired his boat, he thought, and he was helping the kids. No, he decided resolutely. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but these thoughts did not ease his disquiet. Perhaps not appropriately named, Rob thought as he recalled the memoirs of Captain Martins. The crew of the Liberty had supposedly seen the Flying Dutchman, the legendary sceptral ship along the Cape Coast, in those days. And now, once again, although there was nothing spectral about this one, the Flying Dutchman was going to haunt the Liberty. Rob grunted as he lit a cigarette. Not yet 7 o'clock on this Monday morning, and already they are at sea, heading for the Storm's River mouth. He yawned, just thinking of the day ahead. The diving and salvage filled him with excitement. He was optimistic too. The weather had cleared so fast since Sunday morning that there was hardly any resemblance of the storm left, except for some high swells. The visibility will be bad, but in his opinion, diving was possible, and from now on, every minute was valuable. He had no idea what plans Gordon Forbes and company were contemplating, but some action could certainly be expected. Any day now. On their port bow, he could see the wooden buildings and rondavels near the river appearing. They were roughly 1 mile offshore, and the tiny buildings looking strangely romantic and enchanting in the early sun. 1 or 2 anglers were on the rocks and on the road behind their camp. A white Datsun flashed past to the river, and Rob grunted. That will be Cathy. Uncle Jos, he called, and casually pointed an arm in the direction of the mouth. You can take her closer now. The marker lies just east and half a mile off the river mouth. I'm going for to keep a lookout. With the half-smoked cigarette clamped between his lips, he used both hands to scramble onto the whale deck in the bow. With his eyes squinting against the rising sun, he searched the seesaw surface for the marker. Jos handled the boat as if it was an extension of his 60-year-old body. With delicate but firm movements of the tiller, he followed Rob's instructions confidently as they bore down on the rocky coast. Then, as Rob signaled caution, he leaned forward and flipped the throttle into neutral, allowing the boat's momentum to carry them closer. Rob used the long boat hook to reach the bobbing marker, at the same time shouting at Jos, who thrust the throttle in reverse. The diesel roared, spewing billowy black smoke through the side exhaust above the waterline, and the boat heaved and shuddered as the crew churned into the wake, dragging the Flying Dutchman to a stop, gently riding the swells. "Okay, son," he called in a crisp voice. "Let's go." Rob dropped the heavy 4-foot anchor over the bow, dragging the rusty chain behind with a noisy clattering. It plunged into the depths. At the controls, Jos cut the diesel and let out a deep sigh, his premonition temporarily forgotten. "Give it a few minutes, son," he advised as he slowly refilled his pipe with strong boxer tobacco, just to allow for the tide. "It's done," Rob said, and as he came aft. He glanced around. "You'd said something about coffee, if I remember correctly?" Jos chuckled. "I did," he asked innocently, puffing furiously as he held the burning match above the pipe's bowl. Rob grinned. "Well, not exactly, but the other day you said that you sleep and cook aboard, so I naturally thought that there must be some coffee aboard," he explained lamely as Jos eyed him with amusement. "And seeing that we have to wait for the others, well, a cup of coffee will be real nice." "You bet it will, and why not?" Old Jos grinned. "Come along." While slurping and scalding hot coffee in the early morning sun, they watched Herbie and Cathy preparing and loading the rubber dinghy at the landing in the river. Presently, the heavy-laden dinghy pushed off and headed out. Herbie was the coxswain, and Rob wondered for a moment whether he had remembered to take the tablets. He most probably did, because he had to stay aboard and help old Jos with the pump and winch, and on his squat fishing boat with its whiff and rotten fish and rolling motion, seasickness would be inevitable and extremely agonizing for a guy of Herbie's seafaring caliber. Herbie closed the throttle on the outboard motor, and they came near the Flying Dutchman, cautiously easing the dinghy alongside the larger boat. Then, disengaging the gear, he tossed the stern painter at Jos while Cathy handed the bow painter to Rob. Thus, with the boat secured, he cut the engine and grinned up at the grey-haired old man. "Uncle Jos," he bellowed, "I'm Herbie and I hate the sea when it wobbles like this." "Pleased to meet you, boy." The wizened old face was cracked into a smile. "No man becomes a good seaman without tasting a bit of his inside, but try a mug of seawater. It will fix you up." "You don't believe in these pills," and Herbie held up a little bottle. Jos grunted disapprovingly. "Nah, boy, nothing like that in my young days. Seawater. Seawater is the answer to the old mal de mer." "Mal de mer?" "Seasickness. Now, let me have those things." It looks like your brother is anxious to get started. Can't figure out how anyone can go down into that deep water. I mean, if the good father had wanted us to swim around like fish, he would have given us gills, wouldn't he? Old Jess growled past the stem of his pipe and he took the oxygen cylinders from Herbie. The latter considered it wise not to comment. Rob and Kathy quickly slipped into their wetsuits and gear. The space was unknown luxury in contrast with the cramped dinghy. This and the sunshine, the drive ahead, and general prospects filled them with excitement as they grinned at each other. Rob's breath caught involuntarily as he got a glimpse of her full breasts under the white bikini top before she closed the zip over them. Wolf! Her eyes accused him, and Rob laughed softly, enjoying the little play of intimacy between them. Ready? He asked minutes later, when they sat side by side on the gunwale as she nodded. As always, she replied smilingly and spat undignified into her mask and smeared it over the inside of the glass. Then, with a quick, fluent movement, she rinsed it in the sea before slipping the wet mask onto her forehead. The spittle prevents the mask from fogging over, she explained to Jos, who watched incredulously as Rob did the same. Herbie, who had in fact swallowed 2 tablets as precaution against seasickness, grinned at the old man's astonishment as he tossed the yellow signal rope overboard and let the weight tied one end take it down. Hey, Jos! Stop gawking at these kids and give me a hand with this. To uncoil the 3-inch hose was a formidable task, and Josh gave a willing hand. Between the two of them, they lowered the pipe over the side and let it slowly down to the bottom. Ready? Herbie called to the 2 divers, patiently bobbing on the surface. Rob nodded and waved. They dove. The water was murky after the storm and the visibility poor. Pressing Kathy's hand, Rob led the way, following the yellow rope. Once they were operating, the rope would be their means of communication with Herbie on the surface. Because he had to handle the forceful water jet, Rob had doubled the weights on his belt to give him a firm footing once below. However, this tended to make him down too quickly, and he had to check his descent. But they didn't bother to stop on the way down, as it was low tide and the water read barely 10 meters at the bottom. They quickly searched around and found themselves right on top of the wreckage. Kathy nodded behind her mask and gave the OK signal with thumb and forefinger. Rob grinned satisfied. This was it. The 2 feet from the hose exit, he had attached 2 handlebars and now gripped it firmly in his powerful hands. He was ready and nodded at Kathy. She jerked on the rope twice. On the surface, Herbie engaged the pump and opened the throttle without giving it much thought. Rob was completely unprepared for what happened next. An immensely strong jet of water erupted from the hose. It tore from his grip and whiplashed viciously, smashing the mask from his face as the water jet propelled the hose through the water. Like a monstrous beheaded snake, the hose coiled, recoiled, whipped, and crazily slashed through the water. Kathy hastily dashed aside and frantically jerked on the signal rope while Rob, blinked and stunned, desperately tried to get away from the dangerously whipping hose. Old Jos stood gently at the gunwale. He was fascinated by this diving. He had seen divers at work from afar, but never close up like this. With his pipe dead between his teeth, he watched in awe as Rob and Kathy disappeared below the surface. Mesmerized, he stared at the bubbles that broke the surface at regular intervals, and he experienced a faint stir of admiration for the two down there. It must take a lot of courage to go down, he thought, as he remembered the 17-foot-long great white shark which he had caught not far from here, barely over a year ago. He shuddered. That thing could have swallowed that whole dinghy all at once. He lit his pipe to rid his mind of this image, just as Herbie swung the crank on the diesel. The two-cylinder engine caught, spluttered once and ran evenly. Moments later, Herbie pulled the hand clutch to engage the pump. Something is wrong down there, Jos observed casually as he sucked on his pipe. The hose has gone crazy and someone is pulling the rope. What? Herbie glanced up from the engine and, appalled by what he saw, dove for the clutch, flipping it over. How, Jos? Why didn't you warn me outright? He scolded angrily. Is it serious? Josh shrugged, sucking on his pipe. I didn't know. Down below, the hose mercifully stopped its craziness and settled down. Kathy breathed in relief and anxiously searched for Rob, but the whipping hose had decreased the visibility even more, and she finned to the surface. Rob was already there, coughing and swearing. A man who could still cuss like that was more than fine. Herbie helped the dazed Rob aboard and gave Kathy a hand up the ladder. With diving gear discarded and each with a Coca-Cola, Rob finally growled. Now, what the hell happened? The hose wanted to bite you. Kathy sniggered softly, and a wry smile creased Herbie's face. I was close too. Rob breathed deep, staring at the two jokers, but suddenly seemed very unconcerned about the fact that he had just survived a very hazardous situation. So much for your kind sympathy, he grumbled at a lopsided grin spread across his face. He had to admit that Hose had done some more musical maneuvers. Now what? Kathy asked soberly when the worst laughter had died down. The hose will work, Rob replied, and caustically added, if Herbie doesn't open the throttle at half speed, the force will be more than sufficient. Herbie looked abashed. How, man? I just opened the speed and let it have his way. I didn't know it. How was I to know what was the right speed? Yes, how? Except that this whole idea was yours. Then Kathy interfered to prevent an argument. Come on, guys. We are all beginners in this, and now we know that the engine must run half speed. She nudged Rob with an elbow. We all had a bit of a fright, but fortunately no damage was done and no one was hurt. So, I guess we can give it another try. Well, why not? Kathy smiled, wiping a strand of wet hair from her face. If the crew is ready, well, they didn't do much so far. Minutes later, Rob and Kathy were swimming downwards with full cylinders and recharged energy, eager to engage the wreck. This time there were no mistakes, and when the water shot forcefully from the hose, Rob stood firmly with the hose, aiming the jet at an angle at the sandy bottom. There was immediately a swirling of mud and sand as the water forced its way. The hose shuddered and shook under his arm, and within seconds the visibility was down to a few feet. But there were results. Kathy remained flat on the bottom with her face close to the point of impact, her eyes and hands searching and eagerly grabbing as the water blasted the sand away, exposing a vastness of old and rusted objects. As the minutes flew past, the bag in her hand became heavier and heavier with pieces of brass, copper, and rusted iron. She did not inspect her pickings, just scooped it up as it appeared. As soon as the bag was filled, she pinned to the waiting winch cable, secured the bag, signaled it up, and returned with an empty one. On board the Flying Dutchman, old Jos stood unwavering behind the winch as each bag of discoveries was brought aboard. Once on the deck, the bag was quickly emptied into a large iron mesh basket and sent down empty on the hook of the winch cable. Herbie only briefly scanned through the finds, and he was appalled. Even Jos watched, enchanted, his pipe dead between his teeth. There was anything from rusty old swords, musket balls, brass buttons, doorknobs, and an unimaginable range of indistinctive things. Once or twice a small bleach-white piece of bone appeared, and Jos recoiled away in superstitious fear, only to approach the basket again when Herbie exclaimed, "But between the bones and mysterious objects, something remained conspicuously missing: the golden coins." They relentlessly worked through the long hours, breaking every 45 minutes for an hour before descending into the cold ocean again. And after each tiring dive, the pile of mysterious objects grew bigger. During the course of the day, 2 more brass cannons were also lifted to the surface, this time with considerably more ease than the first one. Finally, with all 14 diving sets empty at the end of their 6th time down, not counting the near disastrous first dive, Rob called a halt. Exhausted, tired, and cold, Rob and Kathy climbed stiffly aboard and dropped their empty cylinders with the others. After stripping the rest of their gear with clumsy fingers, they smiled thankfully as Jos handed each a mug of freshly made coffee. Dankie dat jy like, subscribe, share en die belbutton druk. Ek lees môre weer verder aan The Long Lost Grave en ek gaan ook video's doen soos ons vorder tussen Rustenburg, Pretoria en Nelspruit vir die funksies van Suidland Burgerlike Beskerming. Geniet die aand verder.